No scissors. The ancient Romans cut their hair without using scissors. Not because scissors did not exist, but because the ones they had were so bad that a barber would rather scrape your skull with a blade than risk ripping a chunk of hair straight out of your head. Today, you will find out exactly how Romans cut their hair, what they did to your beard, why going to the barber could cost you your face, and why a bad haircut could wreck your reputation across the entire city. Start with the main weapon. The Roman razor was called a novacula. It was an iron or bronze blade with no folding handle like modern razors, closer to a small knife with a curved edge. And here is the problem. Roman iron was soft. It rusted. It lost its edge with ridiculous speed. The barber had to keep sharpening the blade against a stone in the middle of your haircut, while you sat there with half a skull already shaved. Now picture that blade on your face. No shaving foam, no cream, no gel. The Romans had none of that. At best, they splashed some water on your face. Sometimes not even that. You were shaved dry, dragging a poorly sharpened blade across your skin. The result was exactly what you were imagining. Cuts. A lot of cuts. Blood. Going to the barber in Rome was an extreme sport. So what did they do about the cuts? Here comes one of the most disgusting facts in this entire video. To cover the gashes the barber had just carved into you, they applied dressings. One of the most common was a mixture of spider webs soaked in oil and vinegar. Yes, spider webs. They stuck a spider web on your face to stop the bleeding. Other popular remedies involved fat, pigeon blood, or even mouse droppings mixed with vinegar, smeared directly onto the open wound. You walked out of the barbershop with your face covered in cuts patched up with filth. And the barber was not some certified expert either. The Latin word for barber was tonsor, and he was almost always a slave or a freedman, someone from the very bottom of society. There were no barber schools. There were no qualifications. You learned by watching, and you practiced on people's faces. Bad barbers were notorious, and Roman poets mocked them in writing, describing men who left the shop with more scars than a gladiator. There is another detail most people never hear. Roman barbers did not just cut hair. They doubled as improvised surgeons. With the same blade that shaved you, they pulled your teeth, lanced your boils, and performed bloodletting, the star treatment of ancient medicine for basically everything. They also trimmed your nails and scraped the wax out of your ears with metal instruments, all of it with the same tools, never disinfected, never washed between customers. The same blade that had just scraped a stranger's beard came straight for your face. In a city with no antibiotics, no idea what a germ was, and no concept of surgical hygiene, that meant an infection could start right there, at a street corner barbershop. A simple shaving cut could turn into a serious infection. Getting your beard tidied up could, in the worst case, kill you. Now let us look at the barbershop itself, because it was nothing like you are picturing. The tonstrina was not an elegant salon with mirrors. Very often, it was an open stall right on the street. A chair on a corner, a stool, a bowl of water, and not much else. You sat there, in the middle of the noise and the dust of Rome, and the barber worked on your head in front of everyone. There was no privacy. Passers-by stopped to watch. They commented. They laughed. And precisely because of that, the barbershop became something far more important than a place to get a haircut. It was the gossip hub of the city. People gathered there to talk, to argue about politics, chariot races, gladiators, and who was sleeping with whom. The barber heard everything and repeated everything. A tonsor was the social network of ancient Rome, a man who knew half the city's secrets and spread them for free. Romans used to say that if you wanted something known fast, you told your barber. The rich, obviously, did not sit on the street. A wealthy Roman had his own slave barber at home, a slave trained exclusively to shave him, groom him, and care for his hair. It was an enormous status symbol. Having a personal barber meant your time was too valuable to queue on a street corner. And it meant, above all, that the blade touching your throat every morning was held by someone you owned.
Think about that for a second. Every morning, an enslaved man walked up to his master's throat, holding a sharpened blade. Romans were fully aware of the risk. There are stories, true or not,
of rulers so paranoid they stopped trusting barbers entirely. It was said that the tyrant Dionysius in Sicily made his own daughters singe his beard off with burning nutshells rather than let anyone come near him with a razor. Real or exaggerated, the fear was genuine. Putting your neck under another man's blade takes a level of trust not everyone had. Now, let us talk about fashion, because Romans changed hairstyles the way they changed emperors, and that is not an exaggeration. The emperor's look set the look of the entire empire. For centuries, the rule was one thing: be clean-shaven. A respectable Roman had a smooth face, no beard. Beards were for barbarians, for Greek philosophers, for men in mourning, or for men who had let themselves go. If a Roman stopped shaving, people assumed he was grieving, disgraced, or on trial for a crime. A beard was a sign that something had gone wrong in your life. And there was a founding moment for all of this. It is said that Scipio Africanus, the general who defeated Hannibal, made daily shaving fashionable in Rome. From then on, shaving became the civilized thing, the Roman thing, the correct thing. In fact, a young man's first shave was a ceremony. It was called the depositio barbae. When a Roman boy shaved for the first time around 20 years old, the family threw a party with friends and relatives, and those first clipped hairs were not thrown in the bin. They were kept in a little box, sometimes made of gold, and offered to the gods. Nero, for example, kept his first beard in a golden box studded with pearls and dedicated it in a temple. A teenager's facial hair turned into a sacred offering. But then came a man who changed everything: the Emperor Hadrian. And there is a detail that explains it. It is said Hadrian had a face covered in scars, blemishes, or imperfections, and that he grew a beard to hide them. He also loved Greek culture, and the Greeks wore beards. Whether it was vanity, fashion, or both, Hadrian grew a full beard, and the whole empire copied him overnight. Think about the power of that. One man grows a beard, and millions of people across 3 continents decide to stop shaving. For nearly 2 centuries, beards were the norm in Rome, simply because an emperor was insecure about his face. And when later emperors went clean-shaven again, the people followed right back. The male fashion of an entire empire hung on one man's whim. Now we get to the part almost nobody talks about: body hair, because Romans did not stop at the face. Body hair removal was massive in Rome, especially among the upper classes. They plucked their armpits, their legs, their chests, and they did not do it with modern wax strips. They used metal tweezers, called valsellae, to rip the hairs out one by one. There were slaves specialized in nothing but this, called an Ellipalus, whose job was literally to tear another man's armpit hair out with tweezers, hair by hair. And here is a detail that captures all of Rome. One of the places this happened was the public baths. There was a section where the hair pluckers worked, and Roman writers complained about the noise, about the screaming. Seneca, the philosopher, wrote that he lived above a bathhouse and that what tortured him most was the shrill cry of the hair plucker and the yelps of the customers as their hair was ripped out. The soundtrack of the Roman baths included men screaming in pain while being plucked. They also used depilatory creams, ointments made with resin, pitch, and even bat's blood or animal bile, according to recipes that have survived. They smeared it on and waited for the hair to fall out. Some of those mixtures were so aggressive they probably did more damage than the tweezers. And women, of course, went even further. Female hair removal was considered essential. Legs, armpits, arms, everything had to be smooth. A Roman woman with visible body hair was mocked. There were tweezers, creams, and they even used pumice stone to scrub and scrape the hair away. Back to the hair on your head, because Roman women built what today would be an entire beauty industry. Female hairstyles in Rome were feats of engineering. That is not hyperbole. Elite women wore stacked structures of curls piled across the forehead, towers of ringlets held up with pins, nets, and hair pieces. Some hairstyles were so complex
they took hours and several slaves working at once. The slave who specialized in hair was called an ornatrix, and her life could be hell.
Because if the hairstyle went wrong, she paid for it. Roman writers describe ladies who stabbed their hairdressers with pins, yanked their hair, or had them whipped over one badly placed curl. A high society woman could have a slave's back torn open because a ringlet was out of place. The mistress's beauty was built on her servant's fear, and to achieve those impossible hairstyles, they used hairpieces and wigs. Where did that hair come from? Two places: from slaves, whose hair was simply cut off, and from Northern Europe. Blonde hair from Germanic women was extremely expensive in Rome because it was exotic and fashionable. Rome conquered northern tribes, and part of the loot, literally, was people's hair. It was cut, shipped to Rome, and sold to wealthy ladies to make blonde wigs. Black hair came from India. Rome had an international trade in human hair. They also dyed their hair, and here we return to the horror recipes. To go blonde, they used mixtures of ash and animal fat. To go black, there were recipes that involved letting leeches rot in wine for days and then applying that paste to the head. Another black dye was made by boiling ingredients in lead vessels, with the obvious result: they were slowly poisoning themselves out of vanity, and bad dye jobs had visible consequences. The poet Ovid mocks a woman who destroyed her hair with dyes to the point of going nearly bald, and who had to wear a wig made from the hair of a Germanic captive. The irony is cruel and very Roman. You go bald from vanity and end up wearing the hair of a woman your own city enslaved. Let us talk about baldness, because this was a massive drama for Roman men. Being bald in Rome was humiliating, and the most famous man in the world suffered from it. Julius Caesar was obsessed with his baldness. He combed the hair from the back of his head forward to cover his crown, the maneuver we now call a comb-over. And it is said one of the reasons he loved wearing the laurel crown was precisely because it hid his bald spot. The man who conquered Gaul, crossed the Rubicon, and changed the history of the West was worrying about whether people could see his scalp. And he was not alone. There were baldness cures that today are equal parts hilarious and horrifying. Romans recommended ointments made with mouse droppings, bear grease, urine, and burnt mouse ash mixed with honey. They would smear anything on their heads if it promised regrowth, and none of it worked, obviously. But the market for desperation is eternal, and Rome had plenty of people selling hope to bald men. Back to the cut itself, because there is a brutal technical detail. Since Roman scissors were bad, cutting hair properly was extremely difficult. The scissors they used were spring shears, two blades joined by a curved strip of metal, not like our two ring scissors. And they did not cut clean. They tore as much as they cut. The result was uneven hair, stepped with mismatched chunks. So the most common cut was short and simple, precisely because complicated hairstyles were impossible with those tools. And even then, bad barbers left heads looking like a disaster. Romans made jokes about it. A man walked into the barber shop and walked out looking like a dog had chewed on his skull. And here is something you would not expect. Cut hair had a life after the cut. It was collected, and in some contexts it was used as material or even used in rituals and offerings. Hair carried heavy symbolic weight for Romans. Cutting it marked the big moments of a life, the passage into adulthood, mourning a death, when people sometimes cut their hair as a sign of grief, entering slavery because slaves had their heads shaved, and the moment of freedom, because a freed slave had his head shaved and was given a cap, the pileus, so that everyone could see at a single glance that this man had just stopped being someone else's property. Think about it. In Rome, your head told your story. A shaved skull meant you were a slave or had just stopped being one. A scruffy beard meant you were in mourning or in disgrace. A perfectly shaved face meant you were a respectable citizen with enough money to pay someone to shave you every single day. A tower of stacked curls meant you had slaves working for hours on nothing but your head. People read you by your hair before you opened your mouth. And women had one more trick. They pinned their hair up with long hairpins, the acus crinales, made of bone, ivory, or metal. And those pins, several inches long and ending in a point, were good for other things too. Romans mentioned them as improvised weapons.
A woman with a hairpin technically had a spike in her hair. There are accounts, some of them close to legend, of women who used their hairpins to attack someone. Roman fashion came armed.
And while we are on the subject of cost, we actually know what it cost. Thanks to a price edict issued by the Emperor Diocletian, who tried to cap prices across the empire, we have the official price of a shave. It was 2 common denarii per customer. It was cheap, extremely cheap. It was within reach of almost any free man. And that explains why barbershops were everywhere, and why going to the barber was a daily routine rather than a luxury. In Rome, shaving was not a rich man's indulgence. It was a social obligation almost everyone could afford. And here is the key that explains the whole business. A Roman had to shave nearly every day to look presentable. But shaving yourself with a blade that barely cut, without a decent mirror and without foam, was practically impossible without wrecking your own face. So you had no choice but to pay someone else to do it. The poor quality of the tools accidentally created one of the most widespread professions in the city. Rome was full of barbers because shaving yourself was simply too dangerous. Speaking of mirrors, that is another detail that changes everything. Romans did not have glass mirrors like ours. They used polished metal mirrors, usually bronze, silver, or copper. And no matter how well polished, the image they gave back was dark, blurry, and warped. A Roman never saw his own face clearly. Never. He saw a silhouette, an approximate reflection, a smudge shaped like himself. Think about the consequence. When you walked out of the barber shop, you could not truly check what they had done to you. You went back into the street, trusting the judgment of a slave with a dull blade, and whatever your friends told you. If they had butchered you, it might take hours to find out, when someone laughed at you in the street. Romans lived with a very vague idea of their own faces. There is one more layer to this that shows how far Roman vanity went. Wealthy Romans did not just get shaved, they got the full treatment. After the blade came the oils and the perfumes, rubbed into the skin and hair. Romans loved scented oils, and a well-groomed man walked around smelling of imported perfume. Some of those scents were absurdly expensive, made with ingredients shipped from the far corners of the empire and beyond. Smelling good was as much a status signal as looking good. And the grooming did not end with the hair. Romans obsessed over their appearance in a way that would feel completely familiar to anyone scrolling a beauty aisle today. They used pumice to smooth skin. They used tweezers, files, ear scoops, and nail cleaners, often carried together on a single ring, like a keychain of grooming tools. Archaeologists have dug up these little kits all across the empire, from Britain to Syria, which tells you something. Wherever Rome went, the obsession with hair and skin went with it. A soldier stationed on a freezing frontier fort at the edge of the known world still carried tweezers to pluck his hairs. That is the part that sticks with you. We picture Romans as marble statues and marching legions, but an actual Roman spent a real chunk of his life sitting on a stool, having a stranger scrape his face raw with a dull piece of iron, worrying about whether people could see his bald spot. Let us sum up the full madness. You went to a stall on a public street where an untrained slave dragged a soft iron blade across your face, a blade that lost its edge every few strokes, with no foam, sometimes without even water, and left your face covered in cuts that he then patched with spider webs or dung mixed with vinegar. The same man cut your hair with shears that ripped more than they cut. And while all of this happened, half the neighborhood watched and gossiped. If you were rich, you owned your own barber slave, and you handed him your throat every morning. If you were a woman, you had slaves building towers of curls on your head, using hair torn from northern prisoners, and you could have them whipped if a ringlet sat wrong. If you removed body hair, it was ripped out with tweezers,
while you screamed loudly enough that the neighbors complained. If you went bald, you smeared bear grease and mouse droppings on your scalp and prayed. And all of it, every single bit, flipped the moment an emperor decided to grow a beard. The Romans built aqueducts, roads, empires, and laws we still use today. And yet, for something as simple as a haircut, a citizen of the most advanced city in the ancient world sat on a chair in the street and prayed he would not walk away bleeding. So next time you complain about the price of a haircut, remember, at least nobody is putting a spider web on your face.